last time about different types of stress disorders. We talked about phobic disorders, and now let's move on to one that a lot of people have at least heard of, or even a lot of people actually claim to have, and that's OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. These are unreasonable thoughts that result in anxiety that the individual can reduce only through the use of specific behaviors or rituals. So there's two symptoms if you are obsessive compulsive. The first one is obsessions. These are persistent, often reasonable thoughts which cannot be dismissed and results in high levels of anxiety. Meaning, like you yourself, something could be reasonable, but it results in high levels of anxiety, such as like an infection or a germ, or something will happen to that person or someone else. Maybe you feel like um, if you forgot to turn the iron off, and so if the iron tips over at your house, it could catch everything on fire and burn the house down. That's a legitimate thought, but most people don't really think about those too often. And a person with OCD would say, I have to go check that 3 times. They might have checked it once, but they need to check it twice, they need to check it 3, 4, 5 times in order for that anxiety to go away. And this is why we associate a lot of times OCD people with hand washing and dealing with infections or germs, because what ends up happening is everybody kind of freaks out. And so you're like, well, I wash my hands, but maybe I didn't wash them good enough. I touch this or I touch that. And there's certain obsessions that these people have that they can't get over. And then what happens is a compulsion. It is a persistent act which is continuously repeated in order to reduce the anxiety created by the obsessive thought. Common compulsions include hand washing, checking doors to make sure they're locked, light switches to make sure they're off, counting certain things. Some people that are OCD are actually hoarders, and when we associate hoarding, we usually associate people that are sloppy and disorganized type stuff, but that's not always the case. Hoarding means you just don't want you to keep stuff because you don't want to lose it for the fear of you not being prepared for something. Now, why do people today say that they have OCD? Let's say that there's you know, um, five objects right in a row, and one is slightly tilted differently than the other ones. And you want to organize certain things. Maybe, for example, like my daughter, she loves to. We have these magnets that are letters like A, B, C, D, and they're on the refrigerator. And she has a little bucket that she puts them in. And what ends up happening is when she takes them off of the refrigerator, the magnet part, like the black part on the back, always is facing up. And if I turn one of the magnets upside down so that you can actually see the letter, like the color of the letter, and not the magnet, she flips it. And she doesn't like it that way. And we would say, well, she has OCD. I don't know if a 2-year-old can have OCD, but maybe. But what we're saying is, well, it becomes an anxiety. That's what we associate with OCD a lot of times. It creates an anxiety or level of tension inside your body, and so therefore Elliot has to flip the alphabet stuff over so that all of the magnet stuff is facing to the front and not one of them is different. And that's not true OCD. What it is it's just something that bothers us. But we would consider it OCD. That's what we use all the time. So a lot of times when people are saying, oh, I'm OCD about this, it's not true OCD. I hope you guys understand that. It's usually just something that you become obsessed with and it just bothers you. But it's not true OCD because it wouldn't necessarily cause a huge level of anxiety. And so that would be part of this. Now, most realize that their obsessions are irrational and unlikely to actually happen, but the level of anxiety becomes too great if they do not complete their compulsions. There's a show, I don't know if the show's still on, it was called Monk, M-O-N-K, Monk, and that was certain things like this guy who had severe OCD, and the show was a little bit was about him. I actually never watched the show. A lot of people told me that I should watch it. I have things that people would consider like OCD. I don't like people touching my stuff. I feel like you guys all carry communicable diseases, so I don't want you to touch my ink pens or my desk or anything like that. And so I have certain things that I really am focused on, and I become maybe obsessed with it. And so therefore I have to do certain things to diminish that anxiety, such as not letting you guys near me to touch my pens. But again, that's not true OCD because it's not the anxiety that I have is not super unmovable. It's not something that I can't deal with. I just don't like to deal with it. Anyway, Monk, I told you that movie, What About Bob? I think that guy has OCD as well. So, OCD. Let's move on to stress disorders, anxiety disorders caused by exposure to a traumatic event. Um, as far as like a traumatic event, it could be something that you have witnessed, something that you have experienced or confronted with an event that was life threatening. And so what happens is you get anxiety because of these events. Maybe you saw a crazy, crazy, horrible car wreck in the winter and you witnessed it, or maybe you were involved in a horrible car wreck in the winter. And so as a result, because of that, you have an anxiety disorder that actually comes as a result of that. Maybe you were confronted with an event that was life-threatening, like a car accident, or maybe there's a tornado that ripped through your backyard and it took your house, and you were in the basement, and the only thing that was left was your basement. And what can happen is it creates anxiety as a result of this. They have something also called acute stress disorder that lasts between 2 days and 4 weeks. It must have happened within 4 weeks of the triggering of the event, of the triggering event. So let's say the car accident, and it has to happen within 4 weeks of that car accident in order for it to be considered an acute stress disorder. And so that would be kind of part of how they would consider you having acute stress disorder because it's pinpointed to a certain event. One of the ones that is becoming a bigger, a more well-known stress disorder right now is a post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. This is similar to acute, but the symptoms last longer than 4 weeks, usually a lot longer. Now, a lot of times we associate people that have PTSD with only war veterans. That's simply not true. Could it apply to them? Absolutely. But they are not the only people who can have PTSD. Technically, anybody can have post-traumatic stress disorder because all it is it's a traumatic event. That traumatic event could be a car accident, as I've said before. That traumatic event could be the loss of a child, the loss of a spouse. That could be a firefighter going into a fire and losing maybe a partner or two. I'm sure that post this COVID thing, you're probably going to have first responders that could have PTSD as a result of this. So PTSD does not just have to do with veterans, though it is very, very common with them, especially because they deal with the chance that they could be killed at any second. Roadside bombs, particularly like ones veterans that have been in the Middle East, they used to just call it shell shock. Oh, it's no big deal, shell shock. He'll be fine eventually when he gets home. But what they're noticing about a lot of these war veterans is when they did come home, they had a hard time adjusting to society and adjusting back to their quote unquote normal life. And that's where they got PTSD. But again, PTSD could be because of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. Those could all cause PTSD. Symptoms of stress disorders would include sleep difficulties. Maybe you're scared to go to sleep because of the dreams that you would have, the thoughts of it. Dissociative episodes. Dissociative, basically, we're going to be talking about that later this chapter, and that is basically where you almost create another personality. Numbness, where you just don't feel anything. Intrusive recollections of the event, meaning the event becomes more vivid and more detailed in your mind, and it becomes harder for you to kind of like move past that. You have flashbacks of the event that could be part of this. You have problems concentrating. You're irritable. I'm going to, well, actually, I'll just do it another time. But anyway, there's a couple scenes in a movie that is called American Sniper. Some of you guys have seen it. And there's scenes where the dad comes home from being a war veteran and comes home from the Middle East. And there's a couple scenes where his wife just had a baby, and his daughter's in the nursery part so the mom can get some rest, and the baby's crying, and the dad just freaks out and starts pounding on the window to try to get the nurse to hold his baby to make sure that his baby isn't crying, and just little things like that. There's a time where a dog's playing with a kid, and he goes over there and just wrestles the dog to the ground because he thinks the dog's being aggressive to try to hurt the kid. And he just kind of goes through these flashbacks, and it just becomes like so super, super real. And it just takes them to a different spot, a different time when this event did happen, and it becomes difficult for them to be able to get past that. Now, causes of anxiety disorders, there's several different perspectives here. The biological perspective, it emphasizes the genetic and physiological influences on anxiety disorders. Basically, what they would say is they could be anything from the low level of the neurotransmitter GABA, which, if you remember, Gamma aminobutyric acid is involved. Low levels of serotonin are also correlated with symptoms associated with anxiety disorders. And so, one of the things that happens with the biological perspectives, again, they're just focusing on the physiological influences, chemical imbalances, those type of things. Um, is that one of the things that could cause it? Of course it could. Again, these are just different beliefs from where this comes from. The behavioral perspective, these are phobias and anxiety are developed through classical conditioning and maintained through operant conditioning. Individuals who are exposed to high levels of environmental stress have greater risk for developing anxiety disorder. So basically, what they're saying is a situation like classical conditioning, as we've talked about before, with like Pavlov and all those, and operant conditioning, getting the reward or the punishment, that is kind of what happens. Maybe people get attention because of these anxiety disorders, so they continue to create more, so they get more attention. That could be part of that. Phobias and anxiety are developed through classical conditioning. So you are naturally afraid of snakes, and so therefore that just continues to develop because the more snakes that you see, the more you create fear. Classical conditioning. You also have the cognitive perspective, the influence of irrational thoughts or worry, which therapists attempt to replace with more realistic self talk. So basically, like you are sitting down with a therapist and they're saying, well, talk us through it. And they're helping you realize that these are irrational fears, these are irrational thoughts. That if you have unplugged the curling iron or the iron itself, it's off. You don't have to keep going back. It's irrational for you to keep going back. Your door is locked. You don't need to keep going back to make sure it's locked 6 or 7 times. And they just kind of help them. And what we say by replacing it with more realistic self-talk is just basically helping them through the problem. In a psychoanalytic perspective, you can imagine what they would say. They would just simply say that anxiety is as a result of unresolved, unconscious conflicts from childhood, meaning that as a result of you having unresolved problems when you were a kid, it's creating more problems for you today. And it just simply becomes very tough for you to kind of move past those things. And the reason you have stress, the reason you have all of these issues is because of what happened when you were a kid. All right, that's it for today. I'm also going to link in your video that scene that I was telling you about from that movie, showing you how tough it is for somebody with PTSD, and hopefully you guys get to kind of understand what we're talking about there. If you have any questions, let me know.